Ignition sequence start.
Thanks again for staying up later. It was 20 years ago this week that men first walked on the moon. Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface first, and not far behind was Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz Aldrin has come out with this book, appropriately enough, on the 20th anniversary of that historic voyage, Men from Earth, which was written along with Malcolm McConnell, and recounts that great adventure 20 years ago, culminating July 20th, 1969. As you look back, is it still something that thrills you to think about?
Well, it does when I contemplate what we could be doing in a short time in the future, if we can get back into that adventuresome spirit of exploration. Those were the active days, the really good, responsive days. There was a lot happening in a period of 10 years.
We got skirt depth. Roger, we confirm skirt depth. Tower's gone. Roger, tower.
Neil Armstrong confirming both the engine skirt separation and the launch escape tower separation.
Yeah, Houston, Apollo 11 and Saturn gave us a magnificent ride.
Mike Collins, the third man on the mission, said he only thought there was a 50-50 chance it would be successful. Not 50-50 chance of survival, but 50-50 chance of full, complete success. How did you and Neil Armstrong feel?
It seems to me, as I recall, a discussion that the three of us had, that it was a little closer to 70%, 70-80%, 60 to 80, something like that. And by successful, we meant accomplishing the objectives. And to us, the objectives of Apollo 11 were to land men on the moon. Not to necessarily go out and kick up the dust and walk around, but to land and then return successfully. And that was mission success. 60 to 80%. And crew survival, I think we all considered was up around 98%, 95, something on that. And of course, we don't have the statistics really in Apollo too much in flight to reach a conclusion about crew safety, but we did set out 7 flights to go to the moon, and 6 of them landed successfully. 1 of them had to turn around and come back. And that's not too far from 60 to 80%.
There were apparent landing difficulties, though, on the Apollo 11 mission, right? As you approached the lunar surface, there was some talk about aborting.
Well, there wasn't a whole lot of talk about it, but we damn near ran out of fuel, and that's kind of necessary. We provided a great incentive for those that came after to make sure they got on the ground in a hurry. Actually, for some reason, the computer was carrying us about 4 miles long. And of course, 4 miles long means you're going to be burning fuel that much longer. And then we were, it looked like, to Neil anyway, that we were coming down close to a boulder field and a small crater. So he extended even further. And we didn't have as good a computer program to give the spacecraft back to the computer so that it could null the velocities, and then we could just control vertical descent. The later, it was easier for the later crews. Of course, they knew that we did it.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. Guys looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on, forward. Forward. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, just. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Before you ever left Earth, it had been decided who was going to disembark first. And was it a flip a coin deal, or was there a reason, a specific reason why Neil Armstrong was first and you were second?
There was reason for it going sort of either way. You see, during the Gemini program, we had a commander and a pilot. We chose not to use that term co-pilot. So there was a commander and a pilot. and the pilot was a junior person, but he always did the spacewalks, leaving the commander inside to make the decisions. And even on Apollo 9, that was the first test of the lunar module, the landing craft in Earth orbit, Rusty Schweikert did the EVA instead of the commander of the mission to relieve the intensive workload on the commander, because he had many other things to be done. So there was some precedent for saying, well, on this mission, the experiments on the surface should be the activity sort of controlled by the co-pilot or the lunar module pilot.
Which was you.
Which was me, yeah.
And he was the flight commander.
Right, right. Now, it's also confusing because I was the LEM pilot. Some people think that I had the responsibility to be at the controls for the actual touchdown.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not true either. Seniority prevailed there, and Neil was the commander during the critical parts of the mission, which were during liftoff, during our flight accelerating from orbit around the moon, or orbit around the Earth toward the moon, and then, of course, in the lunar module for the landing and the liftoff. Because Mike had to control the command module with or without us, because we might not make it back, why he was the expert in the command module and relieved some of the workload on Neil for the re-entry and the landing. So we were sort of passengers coming back with Neil. So there's an idea to trying to spread the workload out. So there was some reason for saying, well, now some of the surface activities, the greater share of the burden ought to be done by the lunar module pilot. And then there's another school of thought that says, well, now, did Columbus let his ensign splash out on San Salvador? Well, who knows? You know, there wasn't TV going on there. There wasn't a lot of reporters asking, well, who was first or who was second?
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming. Okay, I just checked getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. It's a pretty good little jump. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches.
Was there discussion about what the first words should be? Those historic words that everyone would remember 100 years or more from now?
wanted somehow to really back off and make it clear that they were not trying to force any words on anybody. So they didn't even offer any suggestions, to the best of my knowledge. And kind of jokingly in the book and other times we've said that en route we asked Neil, gee, have you thought about what you're going to say yet, you know, when you walk down the ladder? And his response was, well, no, not quite yet. And we both knew we were both kidding because he'd given it a lot of thought. And I suspect that the same person that provided some advice for the Apollo 8 crew that read from Genesis, Christmas Eve, 1968, had something to do with a suggested phrase or two for Neil. And I think that's good. I'm a great believer in consensus or reaching a decision. If you're in doubt, ask some experts for advice.
I'm going to step off the LEM. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
Stay tuned. Later, we'll be right back.
No matter to hop down from one step to the next. You've got 3 more steps and then a long one. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down to about the 4th rung up. There you go. Okay, now I think I'll do the same. A little more. About another inch. There, you got it? That's a good step. Beautiful view. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here.
Back now with Buzz Aldrin. What does the surface of the moon feel like beneath your feet?
That's a nicer question than what did it feel like to reach the moon or to be the first. What does the surface feel like? I've always had difficulty with trying to encapsulate what it felt like to have the responsibility to be one of the first guys to be on the moon. And we've tried to come up with answers, and someone said, well, when somebody asks you what it was like to put your foot on the moon, just say crunchy, you know. Well, it wasn't crunchy at all. It was very dusty, very fine powder, and there's no sound on the moon, and there's relatively little feeling. The boots that we have are really very soft, and of course, even with all the massive backpack on, where on Earth we'd have weighed over 350 pounds about, on the moon we only weighed 360 pounds. So there was not much pressure pushing us down. A big heavy backpack, to sort of counteract that, you have a tendency to lean forward.
Was it more like the feel of snow or the feel of sand or beneath your feet?
Well, you know, one of the first things that I did after I got on the surface and held on and then bounced around a little bit was to do a little bit of jogging. And I'd set out to do that, so hopefully the people back home would be watching, and the experts on mobility would be making careful measurements of my turning around, and I think they were really saying, what's that crazy guy doing up there? But I was trying to check the mobility and how you had to account for the mass that you actually had, even though you didn't weigh very much.
Same mass.
Same mass. So when you want to turn,
weight.
it takes you a couple of turns. You know, so you have a dog that wants to turn on a very slippery floor. He kind of goes like this and he turns. You have to sort of do that if you're in a hurry.
Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, it came in peace for all mankind.
When you embedded the flag, the surface wasn't firm enough to really hold it. It was hard to really get it in there, right?
Well, we didn't have that thorough knowledge of what they call the soil mechanics. Several Surveyor unmanned spacecraft had landed before we did, so we're pretty sure that contrary to that famous scientist who nobody remembers now because we didn't sink in 50 feet, as he said we were going to, you know, but if we had, his name would be emblazoned.
Right, over your tombstone.
Humpty Hump said that we're going to sink in, yeah. But it was very, very compact. And I noticed very early that as my foot would hit the lunar surface, that all the little particles would go out and it all kind of hit in one place. And it was very strange.
They all moved out at the same speed from...
All the little particles that you'd hit. And evidently you create, when your foot hits the dust, without any atmosphere and any molecules to slow down or to be cohesive to the dust, it all kind of goes out at about the same angle. And since it goes out at that angle and that velocity, it's all going to reach about the same spot.
Yeah.
And nothing disturbs it. Nothing makes it billow.
Eerie.
Yeah, it's very, very strange.
But in a sense, I say this only partly tongue-in-cheek, it almost would have been good if there had been a fourth seat and they could have sent a poet. Because when you got back, it was a great scientific and technological achievement. But of course, there are people like myself who don't know from science, but are moved by the romance and the adventure of it. And now here were military people, astronauts, articulate men, but not by nature people given to expressing these overwhelming emotions. Did you find that troublesome?
I guess in those days, whenever I was asked to come up with something clever or appropriate or meaningful, I found that troublesome.
Yeah.
I was interested in talking about the mechanics of rendezvous or something else. I'm comfortable doing that, and I'm comfortable talking about how to get to Mars now.
People wanted you to move them with some tremendous observation about a place that, even to this day, only 12 men have set foot.
Well, you know, we could take a poet, but think of the pressure that's on that poet to come up with just the right phrase, you know. He's really...
That's right. If he blows it, he has no
gun.
reason for existence.
And he probably doesn't really put it together until several days after he's back, you know, and then reflects on, gee, what should I have thought of at that time? And he's pretty good at doing that. We're just not too good, maybe, at putting those phrases together afterwards. So on the spur of the moment, you got to come up with, wonderful, great, isn't that fantastic, wow.
It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here.
What do you recall about the phone call from Nixon and then your subsequent meeting once you were back on planet Earth with the president?
Well, it's one of those things, I wish someone had said, hey, you guys are going to have a phone call when you get there, so if you want to say something to the president, start thinking about what you might say. It was quite a surprise to me. I thought we were pretty busy doing important things. Somehow it struck me at the moment that he was interrupting our activities in our brief period of time.
But I'm guessing you didn't tell him that.
No, I didn't tell him that.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but men of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity and with a vision for the future.
Roger, understand. We're number one on the runway.
Why wouldn't they let you and the other astronauts keep moon rocks for yourself?
Well, it was government property. I guess it all belongs to the people. At the time, there were this small minority of scientists who said, geez, if there are any germs up there, they got to be very hardy germs to survive, and they might be very hazardous if we were to bring them back. So, you know, the alarmists prevailed, and we had to protect ourselves with these isolation garments and soap off, you know, after we came back. But we were really protecting you guys if we had the germs. So we were potentially toxic. So we were in isolation.
What souvenirs do you have?
Well, we carried a number of things. Carried some envelopes that were stamped. Carried several flags. At one time, when I went over to the Soviet Union, I have a small little Russian flag that I took to the moon. That particular time, I didn't feel like they went overboard to welcome my presence over there, so I decided not to give it to them. There'll be some time, maybe, when that'll be more appropriate.
You did leave a memorial on the moon to Ed White and Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and the Soviet cosmonauts.
The two cosmonauts, Yuri Gagarin, who died in an airplane accident, and Vladimir Komarov, who died in the first test flight of their Soyuz spacecraft, the one they're still flying today. And we also left a small silicon disc with messages from some 72 or 75 leaders of the world who were laser printed or something on that. And we left an olive branch that represented the portion of our patch that signified peace.
Is there a special fraternity that lasts after the missions are over and after the official connection to NASA is finished? Is there a special fraternity among those people who have been in the program?
Well, I think there is. I frankly wish there were a bit more camaraderie to it. I wish that just somehow spontaneously we would desire to get together once a year, and I tried to be a catalyst for that, and it's really difficult. It looked like trying to bring together some of the ones that had been part of the program were viewed as a threat to those who are the active, because we might say something about how things ought to be done, and it might change their empire. We're all individuals, highly individualistic people selected for this task, and whether that results in being prima donnas or not, I don't really know. But each person is doing their own thing, trying to get the space flight that you'd like to get, and there was no way of knowing how you stood relative to anyone else until someone said, hey, you're on the crew and your mission's going to do this. And that's a once or twice in a lifetime opportunity, depending on what kind of a space flight it is, you really want, and that tends to breed a little bit of competitiveness, maybe not real open, but maybe behind the scenes. And I think that still exists now.
If you were to walk out of the studio tonight and there was a brilliant, beautiful full moon overhead, you think you would regard it differently? That would have a different effect on you as you gazed up at it than it would on the rest of us?
Oh, I'm sure it would. All of us that have been a part of the Apollo program, the closer you were to the apex of the pyramid of being able to really be those that carried out the objective of Apollo, reaching the moon. 24 of us left the gravity attraction of the Earth and became under the gravity attraction of the moon. One of them, who was elected for Congress, died from cancer. He's no longer with us. 23 of us survived. 12 have walked on the moon. And certainly we look at the moon at any time in a slightly different way. It can provide that trigger to think back about those memorable days.
Beautiful view. Magnificent sight out here.
And Malcolm McConnell reliving the glorious mission 20 years ago this week, July 20th, 1969. Sincere thanks to Buzz Aldrin, and we'll see you later.
Bob's guest tomorrow will be auto racer Danny Sullivan.